Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I hope you can all hear me well. My name is Els, and I will be moderating the webinar in the background. Today's webinar is about the standardization request for the machinery regulation, and it will explain you how to have a smooth transition from the directive to the regulation. Now, on the next slide, you will just see my face, I think. If you can just click through the next slide. Hugo, are you there? Okay, thank you. So my name is Els, and I will be moderating in the background this webinar. I would like to advise you to use the Q&A panel to submit your questions because you're all muted. You can see there are more than 250 persons connected for the moment, so that's too much to have you all unmuted. Please use the Q&A for submitting your questions, and then the speakers and myself will do our best to reply as many questions as possible today. We are also on Twitter, so should you be on Twitter as well, you can use the hashtag training for standards, and CEN and CENELEC can be found at standards for EU. Now we are recording this webinar, so it will be made available for you later on together with the presentation. So should you want to still consult it afterwards, that would be possible as well. Now, without further ado, I'd like to jump into the next slide where we have the agenda. We have the pleasure today to have Mr. Peter Broertjes from the Commission. He's working as a policy officer for machinery at the Commission. He will do some introductory remarks, together also with Mr. Wohnsland, the CEN and CENELEC sector rapporteur on machinery. He will talk about the impact on standardization. My colleagues Nuno and Joanna are connected today as well. They will deep dive into the content of a typical standardization request. We've foreseen a break in between those presentations, and then afterwards we go further with Hugo and Joanna on more particularities, and especially what is so important for you and required from the technical bodies connected today. So we hope this webinar will be interesting for you. We will close down with a Q&A and a closing remark from Frankowska again. So please feel free to use the Q&A and bear with us because you're many today to be connected. We'll also, as usual, we plan to have a Q&A report available after the webinar. So if your question remains unreplied, you will have the answer later on. So without further ado, I hope you're still connected. Mr. Peter Broertjes will give you a small introduction. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Els, and good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Broertjes. I work for the European Commission, and I am going to help CEN and CENELEC in today's seminar on the mythical beast called Standardization Request. And now, my job is basically to explain a little bit why we are doing this. And it is really my privilege to be in this seminar, that I was invited by the colleagues of CEN and CENELEC to give you the background basically of what is leading to the necessity for this exercise. And I might want to stress that it's also a very, very, very important exercise, because basically it maps out also the future for the work that you will be embarking on, and is essential outcome that is for not only the industry side, but also for the protection of citizens in the EU. So if you go to the next slide, please. Where are we today? So probably I'm preaching for the choir right now, but I want to give it a little bit of context. So we have a Machinery Directive 2006/42, which is supported by over 800 harmonized standards. And basically it's there to ensure, as I said, the safety and protection for users of machinery and people around it, basically EU citizens. If we go to the next slide, I think it will start a a little bit of an animation. So basically what you see on is the legislation that you can download, and in this legislation or part of the legislation is also a list of all these standards, more than 800. Next slide, please. It's being replaced. That's also something you know, because we have to make sure that the legislation is future-proof. You may ask from why? It has been working great so far, no problems. But of course, we are now embarking in a digital age. There are now new emerging risks. That's something that we have to address. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that also there will be a high level of trust by the public using it, for instance, new technologies. And so we are making a new regulation that's fit for the digital age. It's not diverging in concept from the current directive, but there will be new things on the horizon. So these key dates is that we have really nearly finished the adoption process. As a matter of fact, it has been formally adopted already by the Council and the European Parliament, so by the Member States and the European Parliament. Now there is still a signature ceremony pending. We don't know the exact dates, but we expect it to be finally published by July of this year. And then what does it mean for you? Well, there's a 3.5-year transitional period in which, unfortunately, it is not possible to voluntarily apply the new regulation. It means that the current directive will stay alive all the way up to the end of that period. And then the transition date to go from the Machinery Directive to the new Machinery Regulation, which will bring some changes for the stakeholders, the machinery manufacturers. It will apply in January 2027. There are a few exceptions because member states will have to report some information to us about accidents with machines. And also, but that's very administrative, there are some changes for the safeguard procedures, basically when machines don't comply with the law, and what member states have to do and how we as a commission have to react to make sure that all member states act in the same way against that non-compliant machinery. But it's a little bit detailed and administrative for you. I would say the most important date here is January 27. And as I said, the final publication date is not yet known, so we don't know exactly if it will be 13, 16 or 17, whatever January. We will find out soon because July is around the corner, which also means that the summer break is around the corner, which makes me very happy. We have to, of course, do all the preparatory work. And that's the standardization request, among other things, to create these new standards. But that can also already start. And hence, that's what we are working on today to pave the way together with you to make that happen. So next slide, please. So what are the aims of the new machinery regulation? Well, I already said, so we want to make sure that we have a high level of trust, we make it future-proof, ready for a digital age, but also, and this is important, because I said to you, the current directive is working great, why would we have to change it? Well, we know that the industry base on our side is good, but not all the machinery comes from our region, and so there could be players out there that may not be so diligent. So we have to make sure that we have a robust set of rules, which you will help also set in the sense of harmonized standards, which reflect the state of the art, which is a baseline for us in terms of the legislation, to create this level playing field. Other than that, of course, we try to make it so that we can boost innovation. So we don't want to be technology restrictive. It has to be technology neutral, which we think is a possibility in our legislation because harmonized standards are, as I said, the baseline, but it's not mandatory. So manufacturers can diverge provided that they still meet the essential health and safety requirements. Another aim of the revised machinery regulation is also to go towards the green transition, and one of the things there is digitalization of, for instance, user instructions or digital instructions, which will actually save, and this is I would say a shocking amount to read, but it is what we have conservatively calculated, and with current increased prices due to war, etc., and COVID, post-COVID inflations, we're looking at the overall savings of 16.6 billion euros per year on printing costs alone. If we go to the next slide, please. The key changes compared to the current directive are, well, we have tried to address some things that are currently, I would say, under the Machinery Directive, can be leading to some diverging interpretations. For instance, when people modify machines, that we have better clarified. So it is giving more legal certainty, and also we are moving from a directive to a regulation. This means that member states don't have to, every 27, each one of them don't have to, let's say, manually transpose it into a national legislation, but EU regulation applies automatically in full in the member states. So this avoids the diverging interpretations or slight differences in the implementation on a national level. Then, of course, artificial intelligence, the important buzzwords, cyber safety, another one. We introduce specific requirements for autonomous and machinery and the ones that are remote controlled. As I said already, digitalization. A new dimension also is that there will be obligatory notified body conformity assessment for 6 product categories. And this is a bit controversial, I would say, vis-a-vis CEN and CENELEC and you, the technical committees, and people that work on harmonized standards, on the creation, because the Commission also has a fallback option that if for some reason, and believe me, we cannot really come up with a reason, so this is really a fallback option that we really anticipate never to use, is that we could develop our own quasi-harmonized standard. It's called a common specification. It's really if for some reason we need one, or the industry would really need something to give them legal certainty in terms of what their design can or should look like, and it would not come from your side, basically. But as I said, this is of course something that we really don't envision to ever use, but we have to make sure that our legislation is also complete, that there are no black holes. And so that we had to create this kind of fallback option. So it is not a vote of what is the word, non-confidence against you, of course. Also, again, the streamlined procedures to fall in line with other legislation, because they needed to be updated. But that's very administrative, not really for you. Next slide, please. So these 6 product categories that I talked about with an obligatory, so a mandatory notified body conformity assessment, are the ones on the screen. Removable mechanical transmission devices, including their guards or the guards themselves. Then vehicle servicing lift, portable cartridge operated fixing and other impact machinery. Then safety components with fully or partially self-evolving behavior, aka artificial intelligence. Safety components with artificial intelligence are basically software, a software package that would be put on the market. Number 6 is machinery that has embedded systems with the software. So basically, when you put a product on the market, that has it integrated. Those are the 6 categories. And then we have also a list with 19 categories where it is optional. So I think that that is what the current Annex 4 of the Machinery Directive is. But as you can see, Annex 1 Part A, so the 6, that is obligatory full stop. And Part B, it is optional full stop. So even if you would not follow the harmonized standard, it would not be mandatory to have a notified body assessment. That's at least my understanding and recollection of the outcome of the negotiations on this aspect. When we go to the next slide, please. So these 6 items for which it's obligatory, so no option, but you have to do it. That is a list that we have to assess on our side. The Commission is responsible to doing that. But we have to base it, of course, on relevant data. And this data is coming from member states. So this is data that they will have to provide in a standardized format according to guidance that we will prepare. So this is something that we have to prepare basically before, I would say, the summer of next year. And it has to be really final. Based on accident data, near fatal, or let's call it close calls, that's how I call it. And other relevant data, non-conformities and so forth and so on. So that's what we will have to prepare. So the template and the guidance, the member states will then have to submit this data to us. We will review it and amend the list accordingly. So the list of 6 could become bigger or smaller. If we go to the next slide, please. The road ahead. So what have we to do? Together, not just the Commission side, but also the standardization organization side and to some extent also other stakeholders. The standardization request, so that's of course the key topic of this seminar. We have to make sure that it's ready, so prepared to go through the final steps of adoption by the Commission by the end of this year. I mentioned already the focus will be on artificial intelligence and cyber safety or cyber resilience dimension, but we have of course 800 shiny and new but also not so new harmonized standards that need to be updated. They have to be assessed if they're still fit for purpose. Is it still state of the art, and does it still provide the presumption of conformity with the essential health and safety requirements, because they will have to be carried over from the Machinery Directive to the new machinery regulation. The third element is something that one could think that why are these called out? Predictive maintenance, namely, and also other areas of interest for international cooperation. Well, in short, that's based for political reasons. So there is a, how do you say it, increased interest for predictive maintenance and everything that resolves around it, because predictive maintenance will have to have some implications on, for instance, necessary skills for personnel. It is also something that could make production more efficient. So this is the famous green transition, you know, and so this has it has a political interest. So that's why we also will put it prominently in a service request for you, basically to take a look at, to see if you can deliver also standards that will be, how do you say it, facilitating the predictive maintenance. Areas of interest of international cooperation, that is, yeah, very straightforward. International relations, we try as EU always to be friends with like-minded countries. I think about Japan, for instance, but also the US, which I would say is more of a love-hate relationship, but in any case, we try to be, we try to find good grounds to cooperate. It's always important for us to have friends rather than enemies. And then sometimes out of discussions, something transpires that has a more of a interest, that all sides think, hey, that's a great idea, let's work on that. And for instance, in this particular case, very detailed, it's about additive manufacturing, so 3D printing, which is something that has been identified as something that we can work jointly on. So that is also something that we will see in the standardization request that's coming. As I said, we are already 800 plus harmonized standards. There will be more because we have new topics coming. So at some point in time, we also have to publish the list overall. This will be my job 2 years down the road, before, or I would say just before the application of the new regulation. And then finally, it is something a bit of a I would say a necessary evil. We of course tend to think that the regulation is so great that it doesn't need any further explanation, like the directive, but obviously that's not the truth. The guide to the application of the Machinery Directive today, we have to make the same thing for the regulation. It will probably be 100 times the number of pages of the machinery regulation itself, because almost every product category has some kind of very specific issue with it that needs to be clarified, because it's not completely clear how to comply. But of course, harmonized standardization activities, so basically your job, is of course a big piece of the puzzle here. And that's why your job is so important to basically be prepared for the future and for the digital age in terms of the machinery. So that was my last slide. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them later on. If you go to the last slide, please, Hugo. It is a big thank you slide with some information how you can reach out later on if you want. And then I give the floor back to Els to continue this seminar. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your intervention. And well, without further ado, I think it's useful that we go directly to the introductory remarks of Mr. Frank Wohnsland, who is the CEN and CENELEC sector rapporteur on machinery. So please, Frank, the floor is yours.
So, hello, everybody. Good morning. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Frank Wohnsland. I'm working as a technical manager for the VDMA, the German Engineering Federation. And since May last year, I've been the CEN and CENELEC Rapporteur for Machinery as successor of Dr. Steiger. Well, we've heard a lot from Peter already now about the basic features of the new machinery regulation, which for many of you probably was a very helpful piece of information, because it's when Peter tells us something, there's always some news behind it, and I'm very glad to have followed his presentation. Now, my brief task now is to make a little bit a link between the new machinery regulation and the field of harmonized standards, because this is actually what we are talking about. Why is there such a standardization request? What is the background of a standardization request? Why do we need it actually? And what are the surroundings? What are the settings? Peter has already mentioned it. It is planned to have a big carryover of this huge chunk of more than 800 harmonized standards in the field of machinery. But at the same time, we know, and we are all well aware, that with a new regulation, as with the new machinery regulation, the technical requirements set out in that piece of legislation will not exactly be the same. So we can be sure that there will be, we know that there are some new or modified essential safety requirements. And of course, this needs to be reflected at some point in the field of harmonized standards. It's not a very easy task. It's not an exercise that will happen from one day to another, but it is of course to be expected that in the very near future, a lot of activities will be going on and will have to go on to deal with these modifications. So let me just give a very, very short overview of it's only some examples actually of the maybe most striking, most interesting and most relevant modifications that we have to face in this process. So the first one is a very formal one actually, because we are all used to having the paragraph, the annex of with the essential health and safety requirements of European directives in the Annex 1. This will no longer be the case. You've heard the Annex 1 will now contain those types of machinery which potentially need some additional supervision by a notified body. No, the essential safety requirements will in the future be in the new Annex 3. The setup, the structure of this Annex 3 is very much like the previous Annex 1, so that's not a big deal. But of course, as we could imagine, science has evolved in the meantime, technical knowledge has evolved. So we know that there will be some modifications in the existing essential health and safety requirements. And I just picked out some of the modifications that seem to be most interesting to me without going into any details, because that's much more the work of the technical committees then. We have a modification in the essential safety requirement 116 on ergonomics, which potentially may require, let's say, an adaptation of maybe some ergonomics standards, or maybe also some of our C standards. We have modifications in the paragraph 1.1 on the control system, on control systems. We have in particular a modification to the paragraph 2211 in the Annex 1, which deals with vibrations, or much more on the information in the instructions for use on vibrations. And I can already say that the technical committee in charge of the topic of vibration considers already to address this change. It's the CEN TC231. We have a whole number of modifications, especially on mobile machinery. So we see a change in the essential safety requirement 3.2.2 on seating. We have a change in 351 on the batteries, where we have some new requirements for batteries with automatic charging for mobile machinery. And we have also a new modified chapter, or new chapter actually, on autonomous mobile machinery or related products, or at least the information to be given in the instructions for use here. So these are only examples. This is certainly not exhaustive, but these are only examples where modifications have made to the essential safety requirements, and where either in the C standards or in B standards, in the intermediate term, it will be appropriate and necessary to update the standards. Now, next slide, please. Hugo, could you switch the slide? Okay, thank you. The most striking new feature is, however, we have an introduction of new essential safety requirements that in this particular format were not there before. We have a new essential safety requirement in paragraph 119, which speaks about protection against corruption. It reminds many people of cybersecurity aspects. It deals with making machines safe against, how should I say, well, corruption attacks from outside. So not only, it's not to be confused totally with cybersecurity. There will be a separate act to that. It's more to make the machine, how should I say, to avoid that the machine causes damage once that potentially somebody has gained access to it. So it's a relatively new essential safety requirement, which needs to be even explained maybe to the people. It needs to be interpreted by the technical committees who may be affected by it. And we already saw that most technical committees will have to deal with it somehow. So therefore, for this particular new essential safety requirement, it is envisaged to have a new type B standard, which will be developed in a collaboration between the CENELEC TC44X and the CEN TC114. CEN TC114 is the one that actually hosts the ISO 12100 on European level. So it's more or less the mirror committee of the ISO committee. And that type B standard should supply solutions to which more or less everybody, in the ideal case at least, which everybody can make use of. Two further new essential safety requirements are more in the field of mobile machinery. So we have a new safety requirement 324, which deals with supervisory control functions, especially on autonomous machines. This is relevant for TCs that mainly deal with mobile machinery, just to name a few, like the CEN TC144 of agricultural machines, the CEN TC150 for industrial trucks, or 151 for construction machinery. As I said, just to name a few examples. Here, there is wide agreement among the experts that it is not so appropriate to refer to a very general type B standard, as the requirements can really vary from machine to machine type. So here it is probably more appropriate to adjust type C standards, or to refer to one particular type C standard, maybe already existent in one of those mobile machinery TCs. Same thing in the end for the 354, which is the avoidance or the prevention of risk of contact with live overhead power lines, which is also supposed to be resolved via a type C standard. Many of the TCs that I mentioned in under 324 are also affected by this one. And at this moment, there is even a task force in the sector for machinery, which is preparing an interpretation of this new essential safety requirement, and tries to find a good solution for the standards. Quite exhaustive, or not exhaustive, but a very, very good overview, let's say, for the main changes between the Annex 1 of the old Machinery Directive and the new Annex 3 of the Machinery Regulation, has been worked out by Catherine Lubineau, a member of our sector forum, and which has been provided to the TC secretaries, which gives a really very good overview for the people in the TCs to deal with these issues. Now, can you go to the next slide? That's then already my last one, and I'd like to move over to the real topic of today, because now the question is, Peter has talked a lot about the new regulation. I have talked a little bit about some of the main changes in these standards. And now I know I'm also a TC secretary, so I'm a relatively practical person in that respect. So my first question, as I see the word standardization request in my standards only in the foreword and at the very end at the Annex ZA. So how does a standardization request come into play here? Or in other words, why have we gathered here today? Because as we see, the changes in the new machine regulation appear to be already, how should I say, they are not addressed yet, but people are working on it. So then many people in the TCs may ask, so what exactly is the relevance of the standardization request? And why should we participate in it? How can we contribute it? How are we getting involved, and why should we get involved? So I can give a hopefully good answer, even a very simplified one, to the first question. To my understanding, and as I said, I'm not a legal expert, it's just from a more practical approach. The standardization request sets sort of the legal basis, the framework for drafting harmonized standards. It gives us the task and at the same time also the permission to draft harmonized standards on a specific topic. Up to now, we were living on a very, very old standardization request from the past that was, I think, drafted under the very old Machinery Directive and was somehow still valid. And according to the new rules, these standardization requests should, how should I say, be limited in time to 5 or 6 or 7 years. And so if we now have a new law, we also need such a standardization request. So without a standardization request, we cannot have a harmonized standard. It's as easy as that. We can carry the old ones over, but if we want to revise a harmonized standard, an existing one, or we want to create a new one, we need this formal permission of the European Commission. And this is exactly the standardization request. I'm sure there is much, much more to it, but just to give you a simplified idea why it is so important, that the standardization request is carried out diligently, that it's worked out diligently, and at the same time that also all the TCs are getting involved in it and contribute to it, because it would really be a pity if a TC is not, how should I say, represented with its products properly in that standardization request, and in the end might get into trouble harmonizing some topic because they might not be allowed to. And once that the standardization request is done, it is a quite tedious piece of work to, how should I say, push something in a couple of months later, because that's quite, how should I say, it contains lots of formal steps to do so. And then the second question, of course, why and how should the TCs contribute to it? And this is now, of course, my very, very elegant way of moving over to the real experts of today, because this will be the topic of the presentation of our colleagues from CEN in the coming 1 or 2 hours. So first, Joanna and Nuno will give you an overview of the generic process of the standardization request. So giving some general ideas what a standardization request is, how it is set up, how it is structured. And in the second talk, Joanna and Hugo will be a bit more specific, because of course every legal field, machinery, electrical products, pressure, whatever, they have their own specificities. So it's not that every standardization request can be exactly like the other one. So Joanna and Hugo will then be a bit more specific. What are the specificities for the standardization request for the machinery regulation? And so with this, I'd like to move over to hand over to Nuno and Joanna. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this overview. I'm heading right away to Nuno and Joanna, who are sitting together, I think, for this description and the content of the typical standardization request as we know it. Please, guys, the floor is yours. You are muted. We cannot hear you.
Thank you, Jels. I'm sorry. And good morning, everyone. As Frank said, the role of this part of the webinar is to explain the process for the development of a standardization request. We will also explain the activities that happen at CEN and CENELEC linked with the development of such request, and then we will explain the content of a typical standardization request. So this part of the webinar is quite generic, and then after this part of the webinar, Hugo and Joanna will explain the particularities of a standardization request for the machinery regulation. Here, what you can see is a number of acronyms that can be quite useful for you for a better understanding of this part of the webinar. AUWP is the Annual Union Work Program for the European Standardization. The COS stands for the Committee on Standards. And the last two acronyms you will see a lot on the slides that I will present soon. The SHRAG stands for the Standardization Request Ad Hoc Group, and the SHRAG stands for Standardization Request. So as I said, these two last acronyms you will see quite often in the slides that I will present. So what is exactly the difference between a mandate and a standardization request? So basically, mandates and standardization requests, they have the same meaning. The difference is that mandates are requests from the European Commission to CEN and CENELEC to develop harmonized standards before EU Regulation 1025 entered into force and became applicable. So this means that all the requests from the Commission before the 1st of January, we call them mandates. All the requests from the Commission after the 1st of January 2013, we call standardization request. And a standardization request is a Commission implementing decision. You know that your mandate is M396. You know this mandate very well. We call this mandate an open mandate because mandate 396 do not have an expiration date. So the mandate 396 was adopted somewhere at the end of 2006. And since there is no expiration date, it means that the mandate is still valid today. So this is one of the reasons why the mandate 396 is open. Another reason is because in this mandate, you don't have a prescriptive list of the harmonized standards to be developed, and you also don't have a specific deadline for the delivery of those harmonized standards. So once you have a standardization request that will revise the mandate, then it will not be an open standardization request anymore. EU Regulation 1025 on European standardization establishes the framework for the development of standardization requests, but also harmonized standards. Article 10, paragraph 1 of this standardization of EU Regulation 1025 is quite important because it indicates that the Commission may request CEN or CENELEC to develop harmonized standards or other deliverables within a specific deadline for the publication of these standards. And Article 10, paragraph 3 indicates that as soon as the standardization request is adopted by the European Commission, CEN and CENELEC is going to be notified, and then we have 1 month to let the Commission know whether the standardization request will be accepted or not. Of course, there is mutual interest from the Commission and CEN and CENELEC that the standardization requests are accepted, and this is why it is very important to collaborate with the Commission, to work together with the Commission during the drafting of the standardization request. Article 2 of EU Regulation 1025 is very important, is on definitions, and this Article 2 defines what is an harmonized standard. You can see here inside the red box that an harmonized standard is an European standard published by CEN or CENELEC following a request from the European Commission for the application of EU legislation. This means that if you don't have a request, either a mandate or a standardization request, you cannot have an harmonized standard. So the mandates or standardization requests, they form the legal basis for the development of harmonized standards. And your question could be, but why do we need a standardization request if we have a mandate 396 that is valid? So the answer is because the Machinery Directive is being revised into a machinery regulation that will be adopted very soon, and the mandate 396 is in support of the Machinery Directive. There is a need to revise the mandate through a standardization request that will be supporting the machinery regulation. So this is the reason. Just for information, the Commission has a database for standardization requests. You have the link here. Not all the standardization requests and mandates are available. I think the Commission uploaded those standardization requests available since 2015 or 2016. So for instance, mandate 396 is not available here, but in any case, the upcoming standardization request will be available on this website for downloading. On this slide, what you can see is the flow for the development of a harmonized standard. First, the Commission needs to prepare the draft standardization request. You should know that CEN and CENELEC cannot draft a standardization request. This is the responsibility of the European Commission. And CEN and CENELEC has then the obligation or responsibility to accept or not the standardization request. And if it is accepted, it means that we are ready for the execution of the standardization request. So in other words, we are ready for the preparation of the harmonized standards. Such harmonized standards can be either CEN, CENELEC homegrown standards, so just CEN harmonized standards or CENELEC harmonized standards, or they can also be developed together with ISO and IEC. During the drafting of harmonized standards, basically, you know very well that there is a compliance check system in place, the HAS assessment system, where the HAS consultants during different stages of the development of the standards will be requested to provide an assessment. It is, of course, highly recommended that you take on board those comments from the consultant, because these will increase the chances of having the standards cited in the official journal. And of course, once the standards are compliant, or if you address sufficiently correctly the comments from the consultants, then the standards are published. We offer the standards to the European Commission for citation in the official journal. And the European Commission will have the responsibility to assess if that harmonized standard is compliant with the EU legislation, so the Machinery Directive, or soon the Machinery Regulation, and also the mandate or the standardization request. So it is important for you to know that the standardization request, when you have it available, it will be a very important tool as well for you to take into account when you draft the harmonized standards, because it could contain some additional requirements in one of the annexes. If the standards are compliant from the Commission point of view, then the standards are cited in the official journal, and then those harmonized standards provide presumption of conformity to the requirements of the EU legislation. So now we start with the different steps for the development of a standardization request. Each blue block that you will see here on the slide means that there are activities or tasks for the European Commission. The blocks below in gray, it means that there are tasks for CEN and CENELEC. So basically, everything starts from the Commission side with the publication of this annual Union Work Program. So the acronym is AUWP, that you can see here. And this is a document where the Commission, this is, by the way, a requirement of EU Regulation 1025, but Annual Union Work Program is a document where the Commission will indicate the priority areas or the strategic areas to which the Commission will need harmonized standards or other standards for the application of EU legislation or for the application of EU policy. Once this annual Union Work Program is available, we'll just inform the concerned technical bodies to provide input. And as you can see here on this slide, the annual Union Work Program for standardization of 2023 indicates that the Commission has an intention to prepare a standardization request in support of the Machinery Regulation. The next step is for the Commission to start drafting the standardization request. As soon as we have the first draft standardization request, we will, of course, contact immediately the technical boards to inform that the first draft standardization request is available. We will launch what we call the Standardization Request Ad Hoc Group, the SHRAG. We will invite the technical board members or permanent delegates to provide comments on this first draft standardization request, but also to appoint experts to participate. And we will inform the technical board members and permanent delegates the date of the first kickoff meeting. More or less in parallel or straight after informing the technical board members, we will immediately inform the technical bodies that the SHRAG was created and for them to appoint experts to participate in the SHRAG meeting. On the next two slides, what you will see is what is exactly the Standardization Request Ad Hoc Group that we call the SHRAG. And the SHRAG basically has two main tasks. The first task is for the stakeholders, meaning the members of the SHRAG, to discuss the content of the first draft standardization request and provide input and comments on those parts of the standardization request to which require some improvement because they could be considered problematic. So this is task number one of the SHRAG. The task number two of the SHRAG is at the end of the process, when we have the final draft standardization request, the SHRAG is responsible for providing a recommendation to the technical boards on whether the standardization request should be accepted or not. Now, in terms of composition, we have, of course, the convener, and normally the convener is one of the chairs of one of the concerned technical bodies. The secretariat is CCMC, so normally the secretary is the sector project manager for machinery at CCMC, and the secretary will have so CCMC will have the responsibility to do all the administrative tasks like invitation for the meetings, collection of comments, helping the convener with the management of the meeting, and very important, ensuring that the comments of the SHRAG are then submitted to the European Commission for improving the standardization request. Back to the composition, we have, of course, we can have directly CEN-BT members and permanent delegates or experts appointed by them, partner organizations, including the Annex 3 organizations, so our societal organizations and SMEs organizations. As I said earlier, representatives of the concerned technical bodies. So, of course, you will be invited to participate in the SHRAG. One representative of the relevant sector forum, and we do have the CEN and CENELEC sector forum on machinery, so one representative can take part, ISO or IEC representatives, and of course, the European Commission can also attend the SHRAG. From my experience, it can be quite useful to invite the Commission in particular when there are some aspects or some content of the standardization request that is not very clear. So the Commission could participate to help the stakeholders in the SHRAG to better understand some choices made by the European Commission. Then the SHRAG also have the task to look at the list of standards that are requested by the Commission, including the specific deadlines. So you need to see whether those deadlines are sufficient or if you need more time. The expiry date of the standardization request. So this is one of the difference between standardization requests and mandates. So each standardization request will have an expiry date, and you need to assess whether the expiry date is good enough. And you also need to look at the key aspects that the standardization request may contain, and also any potential needs for funding. And my colleagues then will further elaborate on this part. In terms of duration, as soon as the standardization request is accepted by the technical boards, then there is no longer the need to have the SHRAG. The SHRAG is just a short-term group to help with providing comments to improve the standardization request and give a recommendation to the BT. After the first draft standardization request, then the Commission will be responsible for submitting the documents to the inter-service consultation. So DG GROW will want to know what is, if other departments, other DGs of the Commission have comments on the draft standardization request. And by the way, before this Commission inter-service consultation, you should be aware that we had an agreement with the European Commission that we should receive the stable draft standardization request before the inter-service consultation. And during this period, and this is quite brand new information, CEN and CENELEC technical boards approved the mandatory use of a checklist for standardization requests that will be completed by CCMC based on the input from the SHRAG. And this checklist will be quite important to show to the Commission the items that are quite critical and that we would like to be improved. But there will be a dedicated webinar on this new checklist for the standardization request. Then the next step is basically the Commission also circulates the document or submits the document to the Committee on Standards for consultation, the COS. So the Committee on Standards is a very important group that is managed and shared by the European Commission, where the Commission and member states discuss all the important topics related to standardization. For example, citation of standards, the HAS system, formal objections, but more important is where member states discuss draft standardization requests, and the Committee on Standards is also responsible for voting on standardization requests, in approving standardization requests. And one important information to share is that as soon as we have any revised draft standardization request, we'll always organize another SHRAG meeting to discuss the content of that revised draft standardization request. Then the Commission will take on board all that input and prepare the final draft standardization request that will be submitted to COS for voting. The voting could take place either in a meeting or by correspondence. From my experience in the last years, the vote is done by correspondence. Normally, member states have 1 month to vote. And as soon as the vote in COS starts, we will inform the technical boards about the availability of the final draft standardization request. We will organize a final meeting, normally, a final meeting of the SHRAG to discuss the content of the final draft standardization request, to see if there is any critical issue, and also to provide, as I said, a recommendation to the technical board on whether the standardization request should be accepted or not. And in case of problematic issues, we may as well organize a meeting with our technical board members or permanent delegates, so they are aware of the recommendation of the SHRAG, but also of those critical findings. And this could help the members, the permanent delegates, to then contact the national authorities to then share the concerns. Once the voting COS closes with a positive result, then CCMC will prepare a draft BT document for decision by correspondence. So the technical boards would have 4 weeks to vote on whether the final draft standardization request can be accepted or not. At the same time, more or less, the Commission starts the procedures for the adoption of the standardization request as a Commission implementing act, and then will notify CEN and CENELEC on the adoption of such standardization request. And then once we are notified, we have 1 month to inform the European Commission via formal letter whether we accept or not the standardization request. By the way, the time frame from the closure of the voting COS until the document is notified to ESOs can be more or less 8 weeks. So it depends, of course, it is just an estimation. It depends more or less how the Commission is dealing with this. And of course, as soon as the standardization request is adopted and accepted, there is the obligation not only to develop harmonized standards, but we also have to prepare the work program, annual reports, and final reports. This is something that my colleagues will further explain this. And basically, if you look at the standardization request, the upcoming standardization request for the machinery regulation, we are in the drafting stage at this moment. So Peter is busy in drafting the first draft standardization request. And then, of course, we are expecting to receive the first draft standardization request for the machinery regulation somewhere in the middle of June. And it is, as Peter said, it is expected that the final draft standardization request will be accepted and adopted more or less in April, May 2024. But again, these dates are an estimation. It's according to the information we have now. But let's see what happens. And now my colleague Joanna will continue this part of the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Joanna Frankowska. I'm a project manager for machinery in CEN and CENELEC. Thank you very much for being with us today, for your participation. So Nuno has explained the process in general for the development of the standardization request. And I will now explain you the content of the standardization request in general. Based on the examples from the standardization requests from the other sectors that were already adopted by the European Commission and were accepted by CEN and CENELEC. So I will walk you through the articles of the standardization request and also through the annexes, because annexes, as it was already mentioned, are also very important. The substance of the standardization request is the request from the European Commission to CEN and CENELEC to revise the standards or develop brand new standards that are listed in the annexes. Usually it is Annex 1, and that need to comply with the requirements that are explained in another annex. Usually it is Annex 2. So normally, in theory, in this Annex 1, we have a detailed list of the standards that need to be revised or developed. However, because of the volume in the machinery sector, we would like to have another solution, and that will be explained a bit later today. Another obligatory element of all standardization requests is the request to have the work program. So there is also the deadline indicated in the standardization request to provide this work program. This is different from one document to another. Usually it is between 1 to 3 months. Here in this case, this is the example, I think, from the standardization request on medical devices. And here the deadline was 1.5 months. This is something, this deadline is something that will be discussed and negotiated with the European Commission in the Standardization Request Ad Hoc Group. But we think that for machinery, it is important that we have the deadline, that the deadline is at least 3 months from the moment of the notification of the standardization request to European Commission. Work program is also mentioned in the official Commission document on standardization that is called Vademecum on standardization, and it's part 3. And here you have the link to this document. It's publicly available. So in one of the paragraphs, some elements of these work programs are mentioned. For example, that it has to at least contain tentative title of the standard scope, and the information whether a given standard is only under this particular legislation. So here machinery regulation, or maybe the standard will also be the response to other mandates, other legislations, because sometimes you can have a standard that is under more than one legislation, as you know. So here on this slide, you see the template of the CEN and CENELEC work program to standardization request, and you can see which elements it typically has. But this will be explained again and more in detail by Hugo in the second part of the webinar today. Another element that is indicated in all standardization requests is the demand to provide annual reports to European Commission. So typically such an annual report contains an update of the work program, and these are the theses that provide the inputs to these annual reports via TC secretaries. And finally, now I would like to say a few words about the validity of the standardization request. That is also always mentioned now in the document. This is new for you because this is different from what we have today. But now, as it was already mentioned by Nuno, all standardization requests are only valid until a certain point of time. So for machinery, because of the volume of the sector, we would like that the standardization request for machinery is valid for as long as possible, maybe for 10 years, if possible. This is a bit longer than usually we have, but again, this is a very big sector. So that would be our request. Of course, that is something also that we can discuss in the SHRAG. But if we succeed to have such a long validity of the standardization request, it will be also an argument to make sure that we work out together good content of the standardization request at the beginning, so that it can be valid for, let's say, 10 years, and there is no need to change it. And also, this is why your cooperation with us is very important. Another element that is often dealt with in Article 5 is that of each standardization request is that new standardization request replaces the previous mandate. So here, the standardization request will replace the mandate 396, the current mandate. Usually, this replacement takes place at the moment of the notification by the Commission to CEN and CENELEC of the new standardization request. But here for machinery, we think that it would be good that the current mandate, open mandate for machinery 396 remains valid until the applicability date of the machinery regulation to ensure a smooth transition for standard drafters and for the industry. So this is also another element that we would like to have and that we are discussing with the Commission, and that will be concluded also in the SHRAG. So now I will move to these famous annexes that contain usually detailed lists of standards. So often there are two tables in the Annex 1. Sometimes there are three. So there is always a table that lists all the standards to be revised, and also another one dedicated to brand new standards. And sometimes there is also a third table which is dedicated to the ongoing work. And you see that this table is very detailed, that it lists each standard separately with the reference, with the title. And there is a column, always column dedicated for the deadline. So this is the deadline for the adoption by CEN, publication date of availability by CEN or CENELEC. And it needs to be expressed as a date with the day, month, and year. And as already mentioned by Nuno, what is key to know is that only the standards that are indicated in these annexes, only these standards can be then developed as harmonized standards. So if a given standard is not in the list that is in the annex to the standardization request, then it means that a TC cannot develop harmonized standard on this topic. So here you have an example of this table 3 that I mentioned. It's about the standards that are under development. Then, apart from the annex with the lists of standards, there is also the annex that contains the information about the requirements from the Commission to CEN and CENELEC regarding this standard. And usually such an annex consists of two subparts. There is a part on general requirements and part B on more specific requirements for a given sector. So as regards this general requirement, this is usually the request to have a detailed annex ZA or ZZ in CENELEC, or the request that normative references in clauses that address presumption of conformity should be dated. Very important, again, that we want to highlight all the time is that if it happens that after the standardization request is accepted by CEN CENELEC, there would be a need to change anything in these annexes to include more positions to these annexes, or to change the date that is in these annexes, in this table, the date to adopt the standard, or to change the date of the standardization request. For that, we would need to contact the European Commission, CCMC, so CEN CENELEC Management Center, where I work. But what is more important is that in order to have any such change, that would require applying all this process that Nuno has explained, which is de facto legislative process, because as you know, the standardization request is now in a decision, and that is something that takes minimum 1 year. So this is not a quick process. So this is why it's important that everything is prepared now well, and that the content is good for all the parties, for CEN CENELEC, so that there is no need to change anything afterwards. So that's it for the part on the general process and on the model of the standardization request in general. And before we go to specificities regarding a standardization request for machinery, I think now there's time for break. Else?
Yes, Joanna, we can indeed have a small break before we continue, so that people can take a bit of time to digest all this, and we can take a bit of time for the remaining questions that are still there. So I suggest we take 10 minutes break, which means that we recap again at 5 minutes before 11. So thanks a lot to everybody already presented, and see you back in 10 minutes.
Okay, see you there in 10 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Are you still with us? Thanks for staying online. It's 10:55, so I would like to open the second part of the webinar with, I think Hugo will continue now. So please go ahead, Hugo.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Hugo Dourado, and I will now try to present the particularities of the standardization request for the machinery regulation, and a bit to transmit what would be required from the TC side, because this is also something important. What are the expectations from the TC side? So the first thing I would like to talk about is that, as you have seen before, okay, on the presentations done by my colleagues, in general, the Annex 1 of a standardization request is composed by mostly a prescriptive list, okay? 3 different types of lists, in the sense that you divide sometimes those that those standards that are to be revised, the ones you are working on, and the ones that you intend to develop. Okay, so this is kind of the rule. But for our case, because machinery is a very big sector, includes a lot of different TCs, and it's undoubtedly a sector that has a lot of developments, and sometimes we need something to be developed very quickly, because technology, like I said, it develops very fast, and because, like my colleague Joanna said, it takes a long time to have a standardization request reviewed. Okay, we had an idea to, instead of having a prescriptive list, okay, to have a thematic list. Okay, so this was what we were thinking about, and we proposed it in the sector forum for machinery safety, and it was accepted that we would develop such an approach. And basically, what is a thematic list? Okay, what is the idea behind it? And how have we prepared it? So on the specific case of machinery, we want to check which were the TCs that in the past have developed standards under the Machinery Directive, and some new ones that might have interest in developing standards for the machinery regulation. So basically, we took this TCs list. We went to check the scope of all of these TCs, okay? And then we created a list, like, for example, I have taken the first 3 lines of the list we prepared to propose to the Commission. And basically what we have done is to go through all the scopes of all the TCs, and then try to group them in themes, okay? So that in a way we are quite generic, but at the same time we narrow the scope of the standards that are to be developed. Okay, so for example, this first line, I kind of gathered the 2 TCs here: TC44X, the scope of CENELEC TC44X, and the scope of TC114, CEN TC114. Okay, which both TCs deal with horizontal matters, subjects of machinery safety, but one is on the electrotechnological aspect, and the other is more terminology, methodology, and safety principles. Okay, so the idea behind this was to give a broad scope, a broad sentence, so that we can include what needs to be revised, what is being developed, yet at the same time, what might be developed in the future. Okay, so this was the objective behind this, and we have proposed this to the Commission. Okay, and as I wrote here, it's our preferred scenario. It doesn't mean that it will be accepted, okay? But we are discussing this together with the Commission, and this is what we have proposed, okay? So if this goes forward and it's accepted, what is expected from the TCs, okay? So the first step would be to, we will send, Joanna and I, we will send a communication to the TCs with the list that has been approved by the sector forum and has been proposed to the Commission, to all the TCs involved, so that they can thoroughly verify this list. And if you have any issues or comments or shortcomings, okay, you will be requested to send this back to us, so that we can do the changes in the list accordingly. Okay. The second important thing that we are that we need the TCs to do, and some of them have already done, because this is a work we have already started a year ago, is to verify the portfolio of standards and then check the potential impact of the new regulation on their standards. And how do we propose the TCs to do this? Is to carefully use this overview of main changes between Annex 1 and the Annex 3 of the machine regulation, which was already provided to the TC secretaries. And as Franco already mentioned it in his presentation, it's a, how can I say, it's a synthesis that was done by Catherine Lubineau, showing which are the essential requirements that have changed and which are the new ones. And these, together with the new regulation text, which was already provided also, can help the TCs check if these changes will, if they have impacted, and what is the degree of this impact on their standards. Okay, so like it's written here, like last year we already, and this year we have already sent some emails asking the TC secretaries and reminding them to either review and make sure it's all correct, and the other ones that haven't done it yet, please do it, because this is important and will be needed as an input in the during the ad hoc the SHRAG, the ad hoc group for the standardization request. The other two requests we would like to ask you is to analyze your priorities and the order of the work as you want to follow it. And this, we don't have like a fixed deadline, but would be good to have it as soon as possible. And then to be prepared to provide your input to the work program. Usually we would expect you to give this 1.5 months after the notification of the standardization request, which is expected to happen between April and May 2024, next year. So, okay, what is the work program and what is the information that TC needs to provide? The work program is basically the standards that you are expecting to develop work with. Either it's a revision, either it's something that you are doing at the moment, or some standard that you expect to develop in the future. As my colleague Joanna said, this will be updated every year, okay? As usually this is part of the requirements of the standardization request. So basically in this work program, the information we need is the name of the TC or the number, the work item number, the reference. If it's something that doesn't exist, it can be a provisory title or a provisory scope, okay? If it's something that is already registered, you can already use the correct one. We need to indicate if this is being developed together with the other standardization requests, okay? If yes, you indicate it. If not, it's not applicable. Then you need to also make a connection if it's between the standard and which annex it will cover, okay? These annexes that we have mentioned earlier. Then last realized stage, if it's registered, you can put the stage, you can just take it from projects. Otherwise, you will say it's not registered. Then the stage that will happen next. Then, of course, the scheduled target date for next stage. This is also taken from the database. And then the deadline for adoption, which is the one stated in the standardization request. And then, of course, a contact from the TC. Usually, it's the secretary. Okay, now Joanna will take over because this is the alternative scenario, which is the prescriptive list.
Thank you, Hugo. So Hugo has explained this scenario of having the thematic list that we would like to have. and hopefully we will have, but this is not guaranteed, as this would be different than it usually is. Usually in the other sectors, there is this detailed prescriptive list. Therefore, we also have to be prepared for the scenario that we will need to have this prescriptive list. And this is why I will explain the impact of it now. So again, in the annex to the standardization request, there can be 2 or 3 tables, one listing brand new harmonized standards, the second one listing the standards to be revised, on all these with the deadlines when they are adopted by CEN and CENELEC. And then sometimes we also have table 3 with a detailed list of standards under development. Sorry, that was a bit too fast. Okay. So it is a bit of a repetition, but we think it's very important that you are aware that in case that we will need to have this prescriptive list, as it is the case in for other sectors, then the list of standards in the Annex 1 will need to contain the information on the scopes of the documents and also a detailed deadline of the adoption by CEN or CENELEC expressed as a day, with the day, month, and year. This example is from the standardization request for plastics, where the table for brand new standards was written in a bit more general way. So these are future standards, so you don't see the references of the standards yet, but still you see there is a quite good concrete information on the content of these future standards, and they are put as separate entries. And then again, there will be a separate table, and this one will contain the references of the standards and the titles, the standards to be revised. And again, there will be the deadline for the adoption. As you can see that each standard is here indicated in the detailed way as a separate entry. Each part is indicated separately. And again, sometimes there's a third table with the list of standards to be completed. And what will be required in case we will need to have this prescriptive list? So here, I'm honest with you, we want to highlight that you will be required to provide more detailed information than in the case of having this scenario of thematic list. And this information will need to be provided quite early, already in autumn, when we will be discussing the content of the standardization request. So then the aim would be that this information is reflected in the standardization request before it is submitted by the European Commission to the internal procedures, internal consultations. Because after these consultations, the draft is stable and then it's more difficult to influence. And after it is adopted by the Commission again, it's a quite heavy process to change the elements of the standardization request. So this element that you can see here is the same as in case of the scenario of having a thematic list. So this is about the need to verify the standards and check what is the impact of the new essential requirements or of the changes in the existing essential requirements on your standards. And for this, again, it's very useful that you use for help an overview that was prepared by CEN CENELEC Sector Forum on Machinery, main changes between Annex 1 Machinery Directive and Annex 3 Machinery Regulation. It lists in a nice way these changes in essential requirements. And this document was provided some time ago to TC secretaries. So then you should normally have it. And we know that this analysis is already ongoing in many TCs. This is something that we requested to start already 1 year ago when we triggered a kind of survey, you may remember. In April last year, we asked you to already provide the inputs and to analyze and inform us what is this impact of the changes in essential requirements on your standards. And this year, again, via the dedicated emails sent to TC secretaries, Sector Rapporteur for Machinery and us, project managers for Machinery CEN CENELEC Management Center, we asked the TCs to carry out this analysis. And in case we have this prescriptive list, this analysis needs to be completed normally about 1 week before the first meeting of the SHRAG. And this first meeting is expected to take place in the first half of September this year. And then what will be different and for sure will be a challenge, but a necessary thing to do is that you analyze then, if we have this prescriptive list, that you analyze in detail which standards exactly TCs needs to revise to align to machinery regulation and by when, so that we know which date needs to be put in the annex, and also which brand new standards you will develop under machinery regulation and by when, or maybe whether there are some standards that are now cited in DOJ but no longer should be cited. And also, of course, it is necessary, it goes without saying, that you analyze priorities and the order of work, because I can imagine that it will be not possible to revise all the standards at the same time. So all this would need to be prepared early, because already before this first SHRAG meeting, so that you are prepared to provide this input in the SHRAG meeting, which will take place in first half of September this year. And also in case of prescriptive list, we will need to provide the work program to the European Commission. So this is the same as in the scenario of having the thematic list. And this is expected, this input will probably be required to be provided by you about 1.5 months after notification of the standardization request to CEN and CENELEC, which is expected to happen in April or May 24. This is taking into account that we'll have about 3 months to deliver it, and it is to have sufficient time to also help you in case you have any questions, or in case that we need to review something regarding your inputs and to consolidate also the inputs from 70 TCs. So that was my last slide, and now I will give the floor again to Hugo.
Thank you, Joanna. Now, again, back to the particularities of our standardization request and concerning the Annex 2. This Annex 2, usually it's where the Commission writes the requirements for the standards referred in Annex 1, okay? And in our case, and this is just something we expect because, yeah, the standardization request draft hasn't yet been released, but we expect that on this Annex 2, matters connected with cyber safety, AI, additive manufacturing, predictive maintenance will be mentioned, as Peter in the beginning has already mentioned. So this is what we are expecting to be referred there, plus probably something else that that is more normal concerning the normative references and requirements like that. So this is like some sort of advice and request for the TCs, okay? So we would like to ask you, because we are around 72 TCs dealing with machinery, okay? And the SHRAG will be online meeting, so we would like to make you sensible for the fact that it's important to limit the number of representatives per TC, okay? And to keep these representatives throughout the different meetings, okay? We would propose to limit to a maximum of 2, okay? 3 if it's a big TC and it's really necessary, okay? The other thing that is important is to have preparatory meetings in the TCs, okay? So that when you reach the SHRAG meeting, okay, you are aware of all the TC opinion, okay? So this is also another point I would like to focus on, is like the TC representatives shall represent the approach of the TC, okay? Not its individual view or just a working group view, okay? The opinion of the TC should be reflected by these people that are participating, okay? So therefore, the importance of having these pre-meetings between the working groups and the TCs earlier, okay, inside them, so that they can agree on a view, and then this will be transmitted by their representatives, okay? Another thing we would like to ask, and because we know this is a very procedural thing, there's a lot of thing you need to know, but it would be important that the people attending the meetings in the SHRAG are familiarized with the process for these standardization requests, okay? So that, as I said, imagine around 170 people talking. It would be good if everybody is already aware of all the rules, or more or less the things work, so that it will make these meetings more fluid, okay? And then, yeah, please be aware that it will be needed more than one SHRAG meeting, okay, to reach the consensus and have the standardization request fine-tuned so that everyone is happy in the end of the process, okay? So, like my colleague Joanna said, these meetings are expected to start in September, mid-September 2023, okay? So, about the EU funding, okay, this will be during the SHRAG meeting. This will be mentioned. This will be asked, okay, if funding is needed to develop the respective standards. What is important to keep in mind is that these funding requests must come from the national standardization bodies, okay, or the national committees from, if it's CENELEC members. And these requests for funding implies using, of course, an administrative process. And according to the Article 10.4 of the Regulation 1025, the Commission financial contribution shall not be a precondition for the acceptance of the standardization request. Okay, so, and again, it's also important to bear in mind that there's no retroactive funding. Okay, the costs that are happening before the signature of the grant agreement will not be eligible. So now we have some time saved for questions. I know that my colleagues have been replying to these questions on a written way, but I also know that some want to have them reply to some verbally. Now, else, I don't know how this will proceed.
With the first one.
Yes, thank you, Hugo. Indeed, many questions have been replied on the spot while you and the others were talking. So thanks for that. I think that's very useful. People have their answers, hopefully. I see that Joanna, for example, has ticked one question, the first one in the list. Someone's asking at what stage, in particular the date, can we publish a standard to the new regulations? Joanna, can you explain this a bit more?
Yes, we can start working on harmonized standards to the machinery regulation very soon. But normally, in order to finalize such a standard, meaning published by CEN and CENELEC, date of availability, for this we would need to have the standardization request for machinery regulation adopted. But in principle, it shouldn't be a problem because it takes normally a few years to develop harmonized standards. So, and we want to have the standardization request for machinery regulation adopted in about 1 year time. So I hope it answers the question from Mick. And there was also the question from Jeremy Dushinsky. Will it be possible to harmonize the standards to both Machinery Directive and Machinery Regulation at the same time? So this is the topic that we are now discussing in the CEN and CENELEC Sector Forum on Machinery together with the European Commission. So the members of the CEN and CENELEC Sector Forum on Machinery, including the European Commission, would like to have this concept of having two annexes Z, two informative annexes Z in harmonized standards, meaning one informative annex Z for Machinery Directive and one different annex Z for Machinery Regulation during now this time until the machinery regulation will become applicable. So this is something that we would like to have, and we are discussing now with the Commission, and the Commission is discussing also internally, because this will impact the assessments of HAS consultants. But we hope that we will be able to have this solution, but we need to confirm it to you, and we hope that we will give you this confirmation very soon. That was it for my questions.
I see that Frank, who is hopefully still with us, has ticked a question from Lars to reply verbally.
Okay.
Frank,
Thank you.
please?
Yes. Sorry for having pushed the wrong button. I actually wanted to respond in a written manner, but then I had to push the button and it was over. So I have to give it now orally.
Okay, no problem.
That's fine. Okay. So the SF is, of course, the abbreviation of Sector Forum, and it means Sector Forum Machinery, which is a group, let's call it, you could envisage it as a sort of coordinating committee with experts from, well, with TC representatives, usually participation of at least one member of the European Commission. The House consultants are very often present. Various industry associations or also non-governmental associations like ETUI are represented there. And it's a forum that deals with, how should I say, general standardization matters in the whole machinery sector. Gives, of course, then recommendations or guidance on general matters. And here we have a very general matter with the new machinery regulation. And sometimes on a slightly more specific actions or topics, ad hoc groups are formed within this sector forum. And there is one particular ad hoc group that deals with this item 3.5.4 with the risk of contact with the live overhead power lines. I think it is pretty much managed by David Goss, who is, I think, the chairman of one of the TCs, very well, mostly affected by these essential safety requirements. And so they work on, how should I say, they do not develop a clear, how should I say, a clear program or a clear, should I say, task for specific TCs. They rather give guidance how these things can be handled in a very general manner, so that all TCs are more or less can try to follow the same strategic approach and the same technical approach, or at least a consistent, that's maybe the better word, a consistent technical approach in addressing these issues.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I see Hugo ticked one more question on the funding, and more in particular. So someone's asking who would benefit from the funding.
Okay, it's Joanna, because I'm on Hugo's
okay.
laptop.
That's fine.
So who can benefit from the funding? It can be both the NSB staff, meaning NSB is national standardization bodies, so our members in CEN, or national committees in CENELEC. So this can be, for example, secretaries, but this can be also the experts, the manufacturers. So both of them. This is to detail it down in the documents that are submitted in reply to the Commission call for the funding. So both of these can benefit. And then there was a question, why do you think we need harmonized standards to build safe machines? International standards do suffice. So these are only the European standards that can have the status of harmonized standards that address the essential health and safety requirements of the European Union legislation. So this is the European Union concept, and as CEN and CENELEC together with ETSI are European standardization organizations, then these are these organizations only that can publish the standards with the status. Having said this, of course, we have very good cooperation in machinery sector with our colleagues from ISO and IEC, and about 40% of standards are developed together. And then as a result, we have identical globally relevant standards that at the same time address the requirements of the EU legislation. And I will give the floor to Nuno to reply to the question from Mr. Wohnsland.
Yeah, so the question is, what happens when the standardization request is rejected by CEN and CENELEC? So, of course, this is not what we want. We would like to work together. We want to work together with the European Commission during the drafting of the standardization request to ensure that both parties, CEN, CENELEC, and the Commission, are happy. Of course, if it happens that CEN and CENELEC rejects the standardization request, then what we would hope is that, and this is option number 1, what we would hope is that the Commission would redraft the standardization request to take into account the comments from CEN and CENELEC on why we have rejected that standardization request. So we would hope that the Commission revise the draft to improve it. And this is what we would like. Of course, the other 2 options that, in my view, are possible but not preferable and not very likely to happen is that the Commission would just do nothing, and then there would be no legal basis at all for the development of harmonized standards. And the third option that would be even worse would be the Commission would decide to go with common specifications, so alternative documents to harmonized standards. And this is exactly what we don't want. So my answer, I would repeat that in case it happens, we would hope that the Commission would revise the standardization request to take on board our comments.
So I can try to answer some more questions. So I see the question from France: if there are 2 annexes Z, do we need only 2 significant risk assessment annexes? So if I understand well the question, if it will be confirmed by the Commission that we can have these 2 annexes Z concept, then it will be these regular informative annexes that are called ZA in CEN and ZZ in CENELEC. So the list of the essential requirements and the clauses of standards that cover these. So this table with 3 columns. I hope I understood the question well. And there was also the question from Annette. Hello, Annette. So it would be good to have a map. I'm not sure what kind of map do you mean. Maybe you can make it more precise, but also to let you know that in order to have a map, we need to have the input from you, from the TCs, which we receive from some TCs, from some TCs we have not received yet. We understand it's also the process. It's the analysis, like on what the TCs will do, takes time. This is something that you need to discuss well in the TCs. It cannot be the decision of one person, and also something that you need to consider well together with your colleagues in ISO and IEC. So we are available to try to have some overviews, but to have this, for sure, we would need the input for you, which sometimes is not there yet. But feel free to contact me by email to explain what exactly you would like to have, because we already have quite much information in hand. And we can also discuss when we meet, end of June, in the workshop of CEN-TC 114. Are there any others that we can answer now? Is funding planned for these translation processes? Sometimes it can be, but it depends what is in the proposal from the Commission. It's a question from Luis. I think it could be. I'm not absolutely sure. I think I saw the translation aspects in the Commission proposal for EU grant. So I think it is rather possible to have, if it is indicated there, but that would need to be something that needs to be discussed with the Commission. Also, what is needed. So you can consider now what is needed to have to get the EU funding, but what is key is that the proposals need to be developed by the members. So in order to have the request for the EU funding, that is, as it is explained, linked with the preparation of the detailed documents, this is the responsibility of our members. So you need to discuss it well with your members, whether your members are ready to ask for the EU funding.
Joanna?
Yes.
Sorry, I realize I'm getting old because I pushed again the wrong button, and I should now respond to a question of Mr. Andreas Storch, actually, yes, which I also wanted to respond to in a written manner, because he had asked me before whether a list was available that would match the different essential safety requirements, be it of the Machinery Directive or of Machinery Regulation, with existing harmonized standards. And my response was that such a list, saying, giving one essential safety requirements and then listing all the standards that address it, is not very helpful, because we have so many C standards. We have about 700 or so C standards, and each of these C standards tries to address, as far as possible, virtually all EHSRs for that specific product type, or at least a large number of them. So you would get an almost infinite line of standard citations, if you want, in such a list. So his question now was that it is impossible or quite unlikely to create such a list considering the C standards, but it might be interesting to have such a list for B standards, actually. And okay, we could take this up as an interesting idea. Maybe it could help, because of course we still have a large number of B standards, almost 100 or so, or maybe more, I don't know. But B standards, of course, usually address only one or two specific items of EHSRs. And I think, just among us, it could be an interesting idea for one of us to try to, well, set up such a list to say, okay, which B standards reply in a slightly more general manner, maybe, to the different EHSRs. So it's, I personally think it's a good idea to. So I'll take this up and really think about it, whether we could do that. For C standards, as Mr. Dosh already indicated, that's not worth it, because number is too big and they are too specific also, the solutions. But for B standards could be an interesting approach. So I'm certainly open for that. But I'm not aware that something of that sort is available right now. But I think it's a good idea.
It's Joanna again. I can try to reply better to question from Mick James. So he said it's still not fully clear for him when we are supposed to publish harmonized for product standards. So in principle, after the standardization request for machinery regulation will be approved, finalized by the Commission and accepted by CEN and CENELEC, which we want to happen next year. Then once this happens, it will be possible to publish harmonized standard, publish meaning finalize, publish them by CEN and CENELEC in support of machinery regulation. But this is for the Commission, but I think I understood well, it's not possible to use them before machinery regulation becomes applicable. But for sure, once it becomes applicable, it will be possible to use them. I hope it's clearer now, Mick. There will be this cutoff date when the machine regulation will become applicable in January 27. Is there anything else that we would like to answer? Peter is replying to some of them, Frank. Okay, Maurizio also said it's not clear. I hope it's clear now. For sure, you will be getting more details soon. As I said, that the details regarding this annex, the final confirmation is still awaited from the Commission. That is something that will have impact on work of us consultant. This is something that needs to be considered well. And once this happens, the Sector Forum on Machinery aims to have a recommendation to the BT Technical Board, giving clearer conditions for these annexes Z. But the concept is that during this transition period, until machine regulation will become applicable, it would be possible to have the standards with 2 annexes for the old and new regulation, if we get this final confirmation from the Commission, so that this transition is smoother. So David goes, there is a lack of a single comprehensive guide to the process and requirements for development of harmonized standards in accordance with the Machinery Directive. Could the standardization request include development of such a guide to the machinery regulation, and could there be funding for it? So it's about this request, I think, from the TC on industrial trucks to have a the guide on the content of harmonized standards and on the process. So what is used in CEN and CENELEC are the web pages, so-called BOS, where we gather all the key information on the content format of harmonized standards, the process. And these websites are publicly available. The guide is a bit more tricky to have, because in case there are some changes, then the guide becomes obsolete. So we think that the websites are rather more pragmatic. But at the same time, we are having the guide in the machinery sector, which is CEN Guide 414. And I think it would be a good idea to revise it after machinery regulation becomes soon adopted. This can be discussed more in detail together with the TC that is responsible for the guide, that is CEN TC 114. This guide also reflects the ISO guide, though, so there needs to be also the discussion with the ISO TC, I guess. So that could be maybe the starting point for the guidance for the machinery sector. That is the update of this guide. And then, as we have said, we can also look into the possibility of developing a more general guide. That would be something to be discussed by the members responsible for harmonized standards in general. So that is something that I think can be looked into. The thematic list. Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, Joanna. I think because I would like to answer the question by Maurizio. And actually he has 2 questions, which I think I can cover at the same time. And it also ties in with the misstep that I made all the way at the beginning in my own presentation, for which I do apologize to you, that I managed to confuse myself even on this. It's about the the mandatory notified body involvement for this one of the 19 product categories in the list. When you are not following the harmonized standard, it's the same as in the Machinery Directive, so clearly also mandatory. Now, why do I actually refer to this is because I think that Mauricio has some good questions, as a matter of fact, very pertinent questions. And also on our side, we're still really trying to find out what the final politically agreed outcome of the machinery regulation negotiations will mean in real life for real stakeholders. So, but basically, we have we're going to have regulation with an application date. And the legislation cannot be used or referred to if it doesn't apply yet. So that's why for everything that we really wanted to do before the January 27 date, we really had to carve out. We had to really explicitly mention that we have to do this before that date, or as from a certain date. So when it comes to the data that we need from member state, we really had to specify that it will have to be done on date X in 2024 or something like that, really with a view that we can apply it before the general application date. Okay, so that's about the stuff that we have actually done. However, for instance, when we talk about products in this Annex 1 Part A, which is mandatory to have notified body involvement, or in Part B, when you do not follow the harmonized standard and you are obliged to do the notified body involvement, all that is in the general articles of the legislation. And because the legislation, it doesn't exist, it doesn't apply, of course, is what the legal term, before January 27, you would have absolutely no legal basis to do anything except from a date after it applies. So technically, it is impossible to get an EU type, what is it, the type, not type approval, but this type conformity certificate. I forget constantly what the name is because we had several names for it over the course of the negotiations. And I come from an old world in vehicle type approval. So that's always why I call it type approval, but I know it's not the right one. It's the EU type examination certificate. So it is for notified bodies impossible to issue an EU type examination certificate before the application date, because if they would do it before the application date, it's based on non-existing, not applied legislation. So that's why there is a clean-cut date. So basically, how does the transition work? It will be very complicated and challenging, I think, also for manufacturers. It is unfortunate, but it is, I think it's a reality, because as I said, some things you can simply not apply before the legislation is actually, applying. So what does this mean? From a manufacturer's perspective, they have to prepare themselves for this. They still have some time, of course, it's not yet January 2027, but there will be some point where for some product categories, there will be a time that they need to, basically, I would say, stop placing products or trying to place products on the market, or that have a risk of not being placed on the market on time, and then follow the new procedure and then place them on the market. It's unfortunate, it's complicated, but the rules are the same for everyone. And manufacturers, they will have to prepare themselves. The second question was for you, what was it? Hang on. There is no adaptation time for the manufacturer, so that's the one that I basically just said. How will the transition work from standards harmonized to Machinery Directive and the new machinery regulation? It's a good question because we have, of course, we call it an implementing decision. It's the big list, or it's a list with, well, it's a big list with all these harmonized standards that are applied under the Machinery Directive. And what we are trying to do also is to get the big list for harmonized standards that will apply under the machinery regulation. So we have to issue it, and we think that we can issue this list before, but of course it won't have any meaning or value, legal value, they call it in lawyer land. It will have no legal value until this famous date of application goes. But we have to face the fact that it is perfectly possible to have a harmonized standard that ticks all the boxes in Machinery Directive. So we can say it provides this, sorry, it provides the presumption of conformity under the Machinery Directive, but that in some very specific cases, it will not be the case for the machinery regulation. So we have to make sure that we do not blindly carry over the list, the old list for, well, the list that will be prepared, the last list that will be prepared under the Machinery Directive, and blindly carry it over into the first list that will be applied under the machinery regulation. Because in some cases there will be a mismatch. To give you one very concrete example, one of the things that is changed for machinery regulation in comparison to Machinery Directive is the fact that there has to be a safety belt interlock. This does not exist under the Machinery Directive, but it exists under the machinery regulation because that is a political outcome. So it was not in our, well, in any case, it has to be installed by the manufacturer, this safety belt interlock. Basically that you cannot start driving unless you have buckled up. So any standard that has some notion of a safety belt under the Machinery Directive and that provides the presumption of conformity, you have to make absolutely sure that this presumption of conformity is still upheld under the machinery regulation. So if the standard would include the feature about the seatbelt interlock, then you're good to go. But there's also a chance that it does not talk at all about this interlock. And then all of a sudden, this harmonized standard does not provide the presumption of conformity anymore. And this is difficult. This is a difficult exercise, and this gap analysis also has to be done. And that's a big and important task of your technical committees to make sure that we have absolute certainty that when we are moving from one to the other, that we're doing a good job. Hence, why we also have to identify this specifically in the standardization request, probably to make sure that we understand what the implications are. So, is it an easy job? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And we rely heavily on you and your expertise to also help us guide us to the finish line, basically. So that's what I wanted to say, and again to stress how important it is that you contribute basically from day one, which is right now with the development of the standardization request, up to the finish line where you will have harmonized standards under the new machinery regulation. So that's what I have to say, but please compliment me, especially Hugo and Joanna and Frank, if you have anything to mention. Nuno?
Yeah, I think your answer was pretty comprehensive, Peter. But in any case, we are always available for further clarifications. And yeah, indeed, more information will come during the next weeks, months, so that everybody is aware of all the particularities and all the these questions that might pop up in the future. So else, I think now we are almost getting to our end time, and yeah, I think it's Frank's closing notes time, I would say.
Yes, thank you, Nuno. I think there are a few questions still unreplied, but we promised to make a Q&A report available, so some of the questions might need some further thinking on how to express an answer. So indeed, Frank, I would like to give the floor to you for some closing remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Els. As a matter of fact, I was still trying to reply to one of the questions at this moment, so there will be some answers coming up later on. So if you can go to the next slide. So before I really come to my closing remarks, I'd like to ask you a little favor. You, meaning all the participants that are listening to us. Els will. Exactly. Okay, here it comes. Sorry, it just popped up on my screen. So Els is preparing a little feedback survey. So I would really like to ask you to participate in that feedback around it. It helps CEN and CENELEC to improve, to understand where potential for improvement is. So please help us, give us your impression of this seminar, which certainly will help us to make good seminars also in the future, maybe get rid of some of the smaller mistakes that we still tend to make. So thanks a lot. I think the poll is going on until the end of my closing remarks, so you have 2 or 3 minutes of time for that. Okay, so then if you go to the next slide, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to apologize because, of course, as you may imagine, the summary of the key points has not been drawn up right now. It was prepared. I prepared it before this seminar. So if I do not succeed in taking up some of the questions and answers, which were very interesting, actually, I'd like to apologize for that. So just as a little, how should I say, overall summary of today's meeting, I'd like to repeat some of the key points that I found highly interesting and memorable, which is one message that I'd like to reiterate again. There is a clear intention to have a transfer, or as we call it, a carryover of all harmonized standards in support of the Machinery Directive to the OJ list under the new machinery regulation, well knowing, of course, that there will be gaps, as Peter just pointed out, and the CEN and the CENELEC TCs are expected and requested, of course, to identify the gaps in their, especially C standards, that are brought in by the changes in the machinery regulation. And to what extent, I do not know, but to some extent, this topic will certainly be part of the new standardization request for the machinery regulation. One message is that is also important, and this was asked from some people in the chat, actually, in the question and answer session. Of course, TCs can and should please continue working on planned and ongoing projects. So the standardization request is one thing that is going on, but of course, there's a huge number of current projects being developed, and of course, this is not a plea to stop working now and wait for some intermediate results. No, any work that's going on standards should go on for the time being. Of course, they will refer to the current mandate M396 under the old Machinery Directive. And as you've heard, we are working on the idea of developing also 2 annexes, ZA, especially for those standards that will be published in that time between today and beginning of 2027, that would have annexes set for both regulations. One, if you want, valid until the end of the Machinery Directive, and the other one becoming valid at the beginning of the Machinery Regulation. One important message is that, of course, the first draft of the standardization request is expected to be received. I was writing here in June 2023. Don't pin me down on that. Could also, of course, be that we see a July 2023 here, but certainly very, very soon. So next slide, please. And this is also the last one already. I can only re-emphasize that the content of the standardization request for the machinery regulation will be negotiated and will be a common product of the European Commission, CEN and CENELEC in this SHRAG. It will, of course, closely follow the CEN and CENELEC process. The TCs are asked to participate actively and contribute to the SHRAG actions via their representatives. As Hugo said, we have many TCs in the machinery sector, so probably we will have to restrict the number of representatives of each TC to, I do not know, probably 2, not more than 2. And it will also be essential that this is a relatively permanent representation. So you do not want to change every second day the representatives of your TC in that SHRAG, because there should be, of course, some coherence and consistency in that SHRAG's work. Key to the success of this, of achieving this standardization request is, of course, the analyses of the TCs as input to the draft. Hugo has already described it very nicely. There are 2 scenarios possible for the Annex 1 to the standardization request. Sorry, Hugo and Joanna, of course. That is either a thematic list or a prescriptive list. And while we have a certain, how should I say, we may have a certain preference, this is, of course, also subject to some legal considerations. And very interesting to see what comes out here. And one important point, especially from my side, is that it is really essential to have the standardization request as complete as possible, as later amendments to the standardization request it is possible, but it is not a quick exercise. It takes a lot of time. It's very formalistic, and if it may easily take more than 1 year. And you know by yourself, if such a prerequisite takes so long, this is not something you want to go through, because you would need to have people to support this during such a year at least. So message is, have the standardization. Let's have the standardization request as perfect, as complete as we can achieve it. Okay, so these are my, what should I say, not final last words now, but this is more or less my summary of today's meeting. I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the CEN CENELEC Sector Forum, because I'm the chairman there, for your very active participation, for your very constructive discussions in the question and answer session. These were very interesting questions. I like them very much, actually. Yeah, I'd like to give back to Els. Again, thank you for your participation, for your attendance. And well, from my side, have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I would also like to thank Peter, of course, and my colleagues from the CEN CENELEC Management Center for this interesting overview. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I'm going to close down the poll just now. Thank you for answering. And then on the last slide, I just want to remind you that we have an upcoming stakeholder workshop on clean tech in Europe. So should you be interested in that topic, there are also still spots available for that workshop. So thank you very much, everybody. As promised, I will share with you the recording and the presentation of today later on, and then we can see you hopefully back on one of our upcoming webinars. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.